Today we're looking at a JTV interview with Dave Rubin. It covers his health, the big fracture on the American right, and U.S.-Israel relations. So let's just jump right into the first major area for improvement, which is really about the depth of the questions.
Yeah, this is a great piece to dig into because the guest, Dave Rubin, he has a very, very specific story about himself. He's the truth seeker in a world of political grifter. It's a really strong identity claim.
It is, and that actually brings us right to the core issue. The interview misses, I think, several really crucial chances to challenge the guest on his own definitions of, what's acceptable and what's unacceptable political behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, his whole central argument about being a truth seeker, it's just left sitting there, completely under-examined.
Okay, so I see that. But let's dig in a bit. Why is that specific thing a weakness? I mean, on the surface, the host is getting some good clips, right? The guest seems comfortable?
Oh, the sound bites are definitely there, but the logic holding them together it's a little flimsy. The weakness is that the interviewer lets Rubin launch these really sharp attacks on people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, JD Vance.
Right.
And then, in the same breath, he offers praise for someone like Donald Trump without ever asking him to square that circle, to reconcile the contradiction. The host just sort of accepts Rubin's frame that he's the principled one.
And everyone else is a grifter. Yeah, it fails to probe where that line gets blurry.
Exactly. It feels like whenever a guest sets up a binary, in this case, the woke right versus the principled right, the host's job has to be to test that boundary, not just to nod along.
Yeah, you have to push on the fence to see if it's solid.
Precisely. Let's look at the part on JD Vance versus Donald Trump. This is, I think, the clearest example of a missed opportunity for a real compare and contrast question.
Okay, yeah, I remember this part. Rubin goes in pretty hard on JD Vance. He says he's playing footsie with the fringe.
And that he's calculated, just trying to see which way the wind blows.
He's basically saying Vance has no core beliefs because he wants to be president.
Correct. But then, literally moments later, Rubin is defending Trump's own rhetoric as peace through strength. He just dismisses the inconsistencies in Trump's past actions.
And he says with Trump, you don't really doubt what he thinks. That's fascinating. You've got Vance, who's Trump's running mate, getting slammed for calculation, while Trump gets a pass for strategy.
Exactly. And the audience is just left wondering, what are the rules here? I mean, if calculation is a bad thing for Vance, why is strategy a good thing for Trump?
Right.
A much better question would have been something like, you criticize Vance for calculation, but you praise Trump for being a negotiator. Can you help me understand the difference between Vance's political maneuvering and Trump's strategic rhetoric?
I love that, because that question forces the guest to actually define his standard. It moves the whole conversation from just, opinion. I like this guy, I don't like that guy, to actual analysis.
It does. It validates him as a thinker and not just a pundit. Okay, building on that, let's look at the Tucker Carlson part. Rubin gives a very specific reason for Tucker's behavior on Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, he says Tucker is praising Christian comfort in Saudi Arabia because he's being paid a boatload of money. And the interviewer just immediately accepts that.
It's the path of least resistance, isn't it? He did it for the money. It's an easy answer. It confirms a bias. But is that really established? Tucker Carlson is an heir to the Swanson fortune. He made millions at Fox.
That's a great point. If money was the only thing, he probably has enough of it.
You'd think so. So a stronger move here would be to play devil's advocate. The host could have said, Tucker's already worth millions. If money isn't the main driver, what does that say about the real ideological shift on the isolationist right? And maybe, why is that even more dangerous?
Ooh, I like that. Because if it's just about money, he's a mercenary. We get that. But if it's ideology, he's a true believer. That is a much more interesting, higher stakes conversation that the host just let slide.
It forces the guest to talk about the movement, not just the man. And then there's the Candace Owens bit. This was supposed to be the exclusive part of the whole interview.
The famous chicken parmesan story.
That's the one. And the interviewer pretty much treats it like gossip. Wow, can you believe she did that? But there's a much deeper question in there. For the guest himself.
I think I see where you're going with this. Rubin says he was friends with these people. He was having dinner with them while they were acting like this. He only spoke out much later.
Exactly. That raises a huge question about complicity.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of just nodding along, the host could have asked, you mentioned being friends and eating dinner with these people while all this was going on. At what point does staying silent make someone complicit in the very grift you're calling out now?
Wow. That completely transforms the interview. It goes from just a platform for him to air his grievances to a real examination of political responsibility.
It really does. It shifts the whole dynamic from two friends chatting to a journalist holding someone accountable, which frankly makes the guest look better if he has a good answer. It gives him a chance to show his own growth, not just point fingers.
So, to sum up this first point, it's really about listening for those gaps in the logic and stepping into them, not just stepping over them.
Precisely. Now, let's move to the second big area of critique, which is all about structure. The episode really suffers from a kind of disjointed flow that bounces between casual lifestyle chat and really heavy geopolitical analysis. And it just waters down the impact of the exclusive political stuff that was promised in the title.
Structure is so important. It's like the invisible architecture of a good interview. When it's working, you don't even notice it. When it's not, you just feel confused or tired. So the argument here is that the flow was a bit all over the place.
It really was. The interview follows what I'd call a catch-up format. It starts with his health, alopecia. Then it goes to old photos. Then a hard turn into politics. Then back to gossip. Then religion.
Right.
And this scattershot approach, it just buries the most interesting content, the Civil War on the right, under all these, personal pleasantries. The jump from the carnivore diet to the future of America is it's jarring. It lowers the stakes.
That makes total sense. It sounds like the host is maybe just working through a checklist of questions instead of trying to build a narrative. But couldn't you argue they were trying to warm the guest up first? Start easy?
A warm-up is fine, but it shouldn't be the main event. Especially when your title is promising a political exclusive. If I click a video about a political civil war, I don't want to wait 8 minutes to hear about it. So the suggestion is really to group topics thematically to build an actual argument.
Okay, so instead of a chronological checklist of what have you been up to, you build thematic blocks. Let's look at that exclusive hook, for example.
The title of the video is all about the Candace Owens and Charlie Kirk fight. But that specific anecdote, it shows up really late in the interview. It should have been grouped with the JD Vance and Tucker Carlson segments to create a solid, maybe 10-minute block on the fracturing of the conservative movement.
That would be so much more powerful. You'd get the ideological split with Vance, the media motivation with Tucker, and then the personal betrayal with Candace. It would give the listener a complete picture of this woke right thing that Rubin is describing.
Instead of just getting little breadcrumbs scattered throughout.
Exactly. It creates a super segment that really holds your attention. And what do we do with all the personal stuff? The alopecia, the weightlifting?
Well, I guess the host included it because it's part of Rubin's recent life. It's what he's been talking about.
And it's interesting stuff. But it shouldn't lead the interview. The talk about Florida and his health, that should either be a cool-down segment at the very end or a really brief intro. It shouldn't get the same airtime as the Democrats' train to crazy town. Yeah, you risk signaling to the audience that diet tips are just as important as the geopolitical analysis. If everything's important, then nothing is.
Exactly. And speaking of transitions, there was another huge missed opportunity for what we call thematic bridging. The host just jumps from politics to religion at the end, like they're totally separate topics. Okay, we're done with politics, now let's talk about being Jewish.
Right, but what if you could connect them? I mean, Rubin spends a lot of time talking about how the woke right, the Groypers, all of them, how much they hate Israel.
That is the natural bridge. Instead of a hard cut, the host could say, you've described how this new faction on the right is hostile to Israel. How does seeing that kind of anti-Semitism from your own side affect your personal connection to your Jewish identity?
Oh, that's so much stronger. It connects the political to the person. It's not just reading the next question on a list. It makes the whole Purim analogy he uses later feel earned, not just like some random religious point he wanted to make.
It makes the whole thing feel like a cohesive story instead of a questionnaire. Spontaneity within a good structure is brilliance. Spontaneity without one is just chaos.
Well said. Okay, let's look at the third and maybe the most critical point, maintaining journalistic distance to enhance credibility.
Yeah, this is always a fine line to walk, especially when the host and guest are friendly or, they see the world in a similar way.
A theme that really seems to run through this piece is how often the interviewer praises and agrees with the guest. And it creates what you might call a fanboy dynamic, which I think really undermines the authority of the interview.
I noticed that too. A lot of phrases like, you are clearly someone that's a truth seeker, or I respect you for so many reasons.
And when you do that, you risk alienating any listener who might be skeptical, right?
Absolutely. The weakness is that the host just keeps explicitly validating Rubin. Now, rapport is good, but too much affirmation tells the audience that this is basically a PR spot, not a real journalistic inquiry. It makes the exclusive feel more like a favor for a friend than a scoop for the network.
It undermines the whole point of the show. If the host is already convinced the guest is a hero, why should I bother watching? The verdict is already in.
Exactly. So the suggestion here isn't to be hostile. You don't have to be a jerk, but you need to replace personal compliments with validation of the topic's importance.
So you frame the guest's value through their unique perspective, not their, personal virtue.
Right. Let's look at the intro. The host says, "Your journey has proven you're seeking the truth." That's a conclusion, not a question. It shuts down the conversation before it even starts.
A much better way to phrase that would be something like, your career has been defined by these major shifts in political allegiance. Based on your principles, how do you respond to critics who say those shifts are just about chasing a new audience?
That's excellent. It acknowledges the journey, which is what the host wanted to do, but it frames it as a subject to be explored. It respects the guest, but keeps that critical distance. And honestly, it's more respectful to give them a chance to defend themselves than to just hand them a compliment.
Right. Another example is when Rubin calls Gavin Newsom an evil lizard person.
That was a pretty vivid moment. Very online insult.
And the host just kind of laughs and moves on. It feels like they're in on the joke together.
Yeah, a more neutral stance would be to just acknowledge the hyperbole and then pivot back to actual policy. Like, okay, setting aside the lizard person characterization, do you think his actual governance style is palatable to the Democratic base?
That brings the whole conversation back down to earth. It stops the interview from just being an echo chamber. I mean, if you're laughing along with lizard person, you're not an interviewer anymore. You're a sidekick.
Precisely. And I think there was one more moment like that when they were talking about the woke right.
Oh yeah, the host just jumps in with, "I really don't like this at all."
That's just a pure statement of opinion from the interviewer. I don't like this. It inserts the host right into the middle of the story.
Yeah.
The host needs to avoid their own emotional reaction. Instead, they should ask something like, so how big is this faction? Really? Is this a Twitter thing, or does it have actual electoral power?
That completely changes the dynamic. It goes from, "we both hate this thing," to, "help us understand the scale of this thing." The host becomes an observer again, not a participant.
And that is the absolute core of this critique. It's about shifting from affirmation to investigation. When you affirm, you close a door. When you investigate, you open one.
It seems like the big lesson here is that you can be friendly without being a cheerleader. In fact, you actually do your guest a bigger service by asking the tough question. It gives them a chance to prove that their arguments can hold up.
Exactly. If you just agree with everything, you're just preaching to the choir. But if you challenge them, you might actually convert a skeptic. You show their ideas can withstand a little bit of scrutiny.
So if we're thinking about actionable steps for the producer here, it really comes down to preparation and then later editing.
To really tighten this piece up, the producer should focus on three things. First, challenge the guest to reconcile his own conflicting arguments. Second, group all the political infighting stuff into one cohesive block. And third, strip out all the personal compliments to maintain a stronger journalistic frame.
So it sounds like a compare and contrast exercise would be super useful during the prep.
Yes. Actionable step 1. Draft, compare, and contrast questions. Review the guest's positions on similar people like Vance versus Trump and write questions that force him to explain the difference. Don't let a contradiction just sit there. Make it the focus of the question.
That's a great tool. And for the structure?
Actionable step 2. Thematic blocking. Re-edit the outline. Group all the internal conservative conflict stories together. Separate them from personal life and Israel foreign policy. If your title is about a civil war on the right, that block needs to be the anchor of the show, not just scattered breadcrumbs.
Right, you have to deliver on the promise of the headline.
And finally, fixing the tone. Actionable step 3. Neutral scripting. Go back through the script and remove personal praise. Just do a search for "I respect you" or "you're great" and delete those lines. Replace them with objective descriptions of why the guest is relevant, like "you've been a vocal critic of" or "you've taken a controversial stance on."
That's a really simple edit that just changes the entire vibe of the show. It elevates it from a friendly chat to a serious interview.
And that brings us to the end of this critique. By tightening up the logic, structuring for a real narrative, and maintaining a neutral distance, this interview could go from a simple catch-up with a friend to a definitive piece on the current state of the American right.
We would love to see how you implement these changes. Please feel free to submit your work back in again for more feedback.
Until next time, keep writing.